be out as little as you have to.
We have had the politics of cooperation and the public interest
being left out of many cross-party briefings and meetings.
The similarities and synergies between World War II and now are telling.
The results will be available within 24 hours, and everyone who gives a phone number will be phoned with the result.
Get home as quick as you can. You're risking not just you and your family.
I think we're going to have a major surge as we get into January.
You're risking all of us.
Everybody's maintained that pull in the same direction.
It's nice to be able to give back to our current local community.
But when we require it, the United Kingdom sends it down. And to me, that is the best indication of the closeness between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom.
The vaccine program was like the light at the end of the tunnel. We could sort of see like the end of what was the worst days of our careers.
Our services have been under a massive strain. Our staff numbers have been pushed to the limits.
We will gradually get to a situation where more and more people will be immune.
For me, COVID has changed things. It has changed my perspective, it has changed my outlook, it has changed my priorities, family time, quality of life, and return to legal practice as a lawyer are now my priorities.
The process this year has been totally different. No exams, obviously, so we had to go through a very thorough process of awarding centre-assessed grades, and I have to put on record my appreciation to teachers and subject leads who worked so hard and so meticulously awarding these grades, and it was done in a very conscientious manner.
Schools opened again in September. Cases were detected in schools, but never alarmingly high.
Yes, so we had again, throughout this, what we've had is this daily focus on what are today's statistics and where are they coming from. And for a while, when schools reopened, that was the thing, possibly due to the sheer amount of people who had to isolate as a result of these cases. I believe there was one incident where there were 5 or 6 cases across several different schools, and over 200 people had to end up isolating between staff and students due to the different groups that they were in, although of course measures were in place to create bubbles. So that was another cause of concern, not so much because children suffer from it, but because of the transmissibility then onwards.
Well, obviously doing a 1-hour review of over a year in the pandemic, so we're going to skip some of the detail, but I think one of the prominent aspects of late summer, autumn, was Gibraltar really developing its testing regime and making it multifaceted.
The results will be available within 24 hours, and everyone who gives a phone number will be phoned with the result, whether it's positive or negative. But do remember, a negative swab today does not mean that you could not catch or develop COVID tomorrow. So it's no passport to ignoring the guidelines.
What we'll be able to do is utilise it as an alternative. Now the alternative is for screening purposes. So when you're talking about, and as government has said, teachers, our health and social care staff, and we know that we also screen a large number of other employers. We've had scenarios with the bus company, for example. All those would go through this process, and particularly if you've got children being routinely screened, then we can do them.
To those who are listening to ignorant, misinformed, or intentionally misleading social media voices instead of listening to our health professionals, you're risking not just you and your family, you're risking all of us, all of our loved ones, and all of our freedoms.
I think when you look back at how we started this, we didn't have, our testing samples were still being sent abroad. There were concerns over ventilators, there were concerns over reagents and swabs, and one thing that you'd start to see is all this infrastructure being put in place, the drive-through testing, the screening tests, the rapid testing, just the emphasis becoming after the initial lockdown on contact tracing and screening. And there's also been highlighted that Brexit played a role in this, oddly enough in a positive way, in the sense that Gibraltar had some of its equipment due to having had Brexit contingency planning. But I think one of the things that was highlighted early on, and one of the good things that arose from not having that first spike, was that the GHA, the emphasis was on making sure that we were not overwhelmed. And if the GHA had been overwhelmed earlier, because as we saw, it came under severe pressure, luckily, at least by the time that pressure came to strike, despite how awful it undeniably was, I think the one thing you have to look back on is the effort being put in to make it more prepared than it was initially for a pandemic that was unprecedented.
So many other hospitals will have had to have confronted a similar situation, but been much less prepared.
For example, in Italy at the beginning, we had a longer time to prepare. It still hit unbelievably hard when it hit. But I think it does have to be highlighted what was put in place, for example, the mobile testing stations, the drive-through, the fact that we went from sending our results abroad and having several days for them to return to having over 1,000 tests on certain days. I mean, that is remarkable.
Good afternoon, it's 1:30, I'm Kellyanne Borge. The Chief Minister has written to the UK Home Secretary to confirm that reports in the media...
Our new scheme, BEAT 4.0, will continue to be paid as a grant. It will be just the same as BEAT 2.0 and BEAT 3.0. But the amount of that grant is now increased from 20% to 30%. Why? Because we recognise that the longer the pandemic goes on for, the harder that trading has become for those of our businesses that are in scope.
In the lead up to Christmas, I remember there being a range of moods.
I think it's safe to say that Gibraltar lost a bit of the community spirit, and it's understandable because you cannot retain that siege mentality, and it did feel like being under siege, which isn't something that Gibraltar is unused to, of course, but that initial siege mentality was, and community spirit that went along with it, that solidarity, the clapping and the donations and the volunteering, which was wonderful to see at a time that everybody was so scared. I think we did lose a bit of that, which, as I say, is understandable.
If what we're going to see now is that when the government calls for responsibility on something as important as the life or death issues that this virus raises, is just the complete irresponsibility of saying, oh, well, if they've closed the shops in Gibraltar, I'm going to go to the shops in Spain. Oh, well, if they closed the bars in Gibraltar, I'm going to go to the bars in Spain. If that is what this community has come to, it is not the Gibraltar that I know.
I think it also is safe to say there was some complacency that Gibraltar had escaped the worst. And we saw that with a couple of our less positive news stories. For example, the time that a member of the infection control team was spat at by somebody shouting COVID hoax information. The time that I remember posting a story that global deaths had topped 1 million, and we had a number of laughing reactions on that story, which shocked me at the time on social media, indeed. And I think we have seen the rise of disinformation on social media and of division, COVID hoaxes and so forth, some of it no doubt genuine, and some of it capitalizing on the situation to boost their profiles and win arguments on social media. I think some of it, as you say, was definitely born out of fatigue. It's understandable. I think the second lockdown was in some ways more difficult than the first. The first one had that unprecedented feeling and that solidarity that came with facing down an unknown enemy. And the second one, people were fed up after a whole year of anxiety. They were suffering from mental health issues. They wanted to see their family. They wanted to have a Christmas, and that is all completely understandable. I think it's also safe to say that there were some ideological aspects capitalizing on that dissatisfaction, and that both of those things are at play in the hotbed that is social media. Again, unfortunately, we saw what happened in other countries, unfortunately, come to pass.
So unfortunately, active cases started to creep up in Gibraltar in December, and we had seen what exponential growth looked like in other cities. But even then, to experience it, when I remember sort of looking at the cases, as I think most people in Gibraltar would, on a day-to-day basis, and really being quite alarmed by the daily increases.
It's amazing how quickly everything happened. I mean, we did start to see cases rise. In autumn, Gibraltar recorded its highest active number of cases since the start of the pandemic, and then we passed 100 active for the first time. But who would have thought, who would have realised the impact of seeing those numbers go above 1,000?
I think we're going to have a major surge as we get into January. I can't, unless there is something major that people do themselves in their behaviour, we're going to have spread of the virus. Everything tells me human beings love to do all the social things. Yes, they're not kissing as much, they're not hugging as much, but some are. And when it's your beloved friend or your beloved family member, I think it's down to Gibraltarian good sense.
At the time, midway through December, Dr. Bhatti again said he expected a major surge in COVID cases in January in line with European predictions, and that proved to be the case. We saw those active cases shoot up, and very close to Christmas, we started to see those restrictions being introduced. Another thing that I remember, another evening that I think we remember, is the night that restrictions were introduced on bars and restaurants to close at 7 p.m. at short notice. I remember those images from Chatham Counter Guard, editing them frantically in time for Newswatch. I remember the protests by people who disagreed with the measures and others who were angry that they'd been announced at such short notice for bars and restaurants.
Today's restrictions will have a massive blow to our trade, to our industry, with huge financial implications. Difficult to quantify now, but to put things into perspective, this has happened in the weekend prior to Christmas, which is traditionally the busiest weekend of the year, with restaurants fully booked.
On the 21st of December, we had catering establishments closed, masks in all public places, and a major incident declared. And at the time, people were still hoping to celebrate New Year's. I think it's we look back on it, because so much happens in such a short time. Time sort of slows down, and you look back and think this happened in such a short period of time. A vertiginous rise in cases, where by early January we had 1,000 cases. We'd only had 6 deaths, and our first death was in November. So it was very late that Gibraltar started to see that actual effect of COVID. But sadly, that rise in cases, as had been said throughout, led to a rise in deaths 2 weeks afterwards, for example, because, as we've been told, COVID cases require some time in hospital, and then some people just don't get better, and that's what leads us to the horror that we experienced in January, which is, I think it's safe to say, one of the worst months of the Gibraltarian history. I mean, this whole year has been one of the worst years, but January, I think, stands out as being a particularly horrendous month.
I recall reporting from number 6 at the chief minister's, one of the chief minister's briefings, where he referred to it being the deadliest period, the deadliest days in Gibraltar's history, recorded history, certainly for over 100 years. More people had died from this one cause or because of it than from anything else, which really puts it in perspective.
This is now the worst loss of life of Gibraltarians in over 100 years. Even in war, we have never lost so many in such a short time.
Yeah, we started to see those deaths, and we started to then see days of multiple deaths, 4 or 5 or 6. And of course, that day that we had 9, which the Chief Minister described as the worst loss of Gibraltarian life in over a century. And I think in a place like Gibraltar, what you really know is that these are people that you know. These are people that you know. This is their grandparents. This is their fathers and mothers and their uncles and aunts and their siblings. One of my former teachers, and you know who they are. And seeing that unfold and every day bringing those new cases was something that I don't think any of us are ever going to be able to forget, or nor should we. it's been, I don't have to tell anybody else, we've all experienced it. It's been just awful.
The Deputy Medical Director, Dr. Hamish Thompson, would later tell us that it was close to the worst case scenario, the community transmission.
We have been fortunate that we have never had to decide whether somebody went onto a ventilator or not based on the lack of ventilators. Our services have been under a massive strain. Our staff numbers have been pushed to the limits. We've had to make some tough decisions about bringing patients back into Gibraltar from other ICUs because we know that our own capacity was getting to the very, very limits, and if a patient was already in a place of safety, it was decided it was better to keep them there than to put additional burden onto a system that was right at the edge of its ability to cope. There are plenty of times I will walk into a bay and the nurse will just be holding the patient's hand. There's music playing in the background on the ICU, often that patient's favourite music. Even though we are completely restricting access to the ICU for patient safety and for visitor safety, in the situation where a patient is unfortunately losing their battle with COVID and approaching an end of life, we do have a mechanism to allow compassionate visiting so the family can be with them for those last few hours.
An important goodbye for them,
yeah.
for sure. We had been warned that high community transmission, even if an individual felt that he or she was young and healthy and therefore not particularly at risk, the high community transmission made it almost inevitable that the virus would make its way into our care homes, which are vulnerable, and are homes to our most vulnerable members of society. And also it would mean that some people 7, 10, 20 days later would feel the ill effects, the worst effects of this disease, and would require hospitalization and even critical care. So there was also a bit of a delay in the impact between active cases and unfortunately critical care and deaths. There was also some international coverage of the number of cases in Gibraltar and unfortunately the number of deaths, both per capita. And I think with the greatest of respect to the Chief Minister, his position on how Gibraltar fared on international league tables necessarily changed.
The total number of swabs taken to test for COVID-19 now amounts to 16,239. This makes Gibraltar the first in the world, top of the league for testing per million of population. We don't need to preoccupy ourselves with nonsense like league tables. This is not the Premiership, This is reality. We have to worry about the 73 who have died on our watch in our country, not what we look like in the context of some league table.
One of the new stresses for young parents and obviously for students and young learners was home learning. I should include teachers in that as well, because obviously they had to completely change the way that they approached education and facilitating children's learning. So that was another aspect of Gibraltarian life which was new and which perhaps will have a role to play in the coming months for differing reasons, hopefully. But after sort of that particular stress, if you like, we had hope.
I think everyone's feeling extremely positive. If you think about it, we started the vaccination program on the 10th of January, and I think that the progress that we've made since then has been remarkable. The vaccines arrived on the 9th of January, they arrived that night, and there was no time to be wasted, and we started vaccinating the following day. First thing in the morning, we started with frontline clinical staff at the GHA, and in tandem, we also started the vaccination program at ERS for residents and ERS staff.
Again, another one of those moments that you remember most from this was that weekend when, again, sadly, we had 4 deaths on that day, but hope arrived. One one detail that is quite interesting is that every single time, or at least 4 out of 5 of the times, it's been terrible weather. So there was that concern that day that those vaccines wouldn't arrive, and then when they did, we had things kicking into action immediately. The frontline services being vaccinated, and ERS residents, unfortunately, too late for a great number of them, sadly. But it was that feeling. It was that feeling that we were in the midst of something terrible, and yet hope. A balance between despair and hope at that point.
It's been a long, very drawn-out process, but we have a glimmer of hope. So I think that little bit of optimism is driving everybody on now. The vaccine program is doing so incredibly well, covering some great numbers of people, and I think that is giving us that little light at the end of the tunnel. So certainly from the clinical staff, we're seeing our numbers settle.
It's not lost on the Ministry of Defence personnel here that we're all in this together. This is a fight against a global pandemic that affects all of us, whether you're in uniform or not. So it's absolutely vital that everybody is pulling in the same direction. I'm really pleased that the way since the first vaccination flight arrived back in early January, that everybody has maintained that pull in the same direction.
The one thing to remember is that the military, we are all part of society. We don't sit aside from it. And whilst the vast majority of us within MOD Gibraltar are born in the UK, that doesn't make us feel less part of the Gibraltar society. We are, generally speaking, we are really welcomed with open arms, and it's nice to be able to give back to our current local community.
So I think we will gradually get to a situation where more and more people will be immune, and we will begin to have what we've always wanted, was an individual assessment of your own risk.
With the vaccines, again, that weird sense of time. It was only in November that Pfizer was proven to be effective, and that the government said we would be getting some supplies of that, and the turnaround of that has been incredible. That hope that we didn't have really. We didn't have that concrete hope before November, and since then, when you consider the hope that vaccines have brought, especially not just in terms of immunity, but in terms of return to normal life, that has been one of the standout things. So with Gibraltar, our size will always mean that our statistics will be skewed, perhaps in relation to others. So we've had this remarkably quick vaccination program. The Chief Minister saying this week that we will be the first nation to have completed its vaccination program. In hand with that, we've also had the fact that our deaths per capita, our cases per capita at one point were truly remarkable from a statistical point of view as well. And those things almost went hand in hand because, as you say, that may well have been one of the factors in that vaccine delivery to Gibraltar, which was in sore need of it at the time.
I think the support provided to the overseas territories, Gibraltar in particular, from the United Kingdom has been extraordinary. The very fact that the armed forces are flying in the vaccine when we need it, the very fact that the vaccination program is running so well, much better than anywhere else, probably in the world, the way we're spinning it out, gives us a sure hope that things are going to get better. But when we require it, the United Kingdom sends it down. And to me, that is the best indication of the closeness between Gibraltar and the United Kingdom. And I don't think you can get a better measure of a mature partnership than the way that the big partner is helping out the rather smaller partner in this difficult area.
Unfortunately, another aspect of spending extra time at home that deserves mention, I think on the positive side, you have for those who had and were fortunate enough to have a nuclear family to spend time with, there was the profound bonding and shared experiences that I think will stay with many for months and years to come. But the flip side to that is that people who are in a less healthy relationship, a toxic relationship, will have seen increased stresses, and we know that the reported cases of domestic violence have shot up over the past 12 months.
I think the stresses that this lockdown and this pandemic has put on people has exacerbated a lot of things that were previously there. And in the case, as you say, of abusive relationships, it took away people's support systems. It took away their escape. In terms of people who were alone, it increased their loneliness. In terms of people who perhaps had cramped living spaces, it made them feel trapped. It's I think the psychological effects of this lockdown on people are still being worked through. It's been a year of anxiety, and the mental health aspect of it, as well as you say, the actual crimes that people have had to live with. But basically, I think that it's just been an absolute something unprecedented for us. And what I would like to see come from this is a greater understanding that in Gibraltar, we've had this unprecedented, again, change to our way of life with a modern health service, with some measure of financial support, with running water. And what I would like to see is a greater understanding of how, for example, war can overturn someone's life in other parts of the world, and a greater tolerance and empathy now that we know what it's like to have our lives overturned for people around the world who have their lives overturned. I would like to see that empathy and solidarity from this be something that we carry out of this.
I have heard a lot of people talk as well about newfound gratitude and appreciation for things that were in their lives already, but which have taken on a different perspective now.
I think, it's remarkable how quickly the things that you take for granted can be stripped away. Just simply the ability to hug your family members, I think, is something that we have all found incredibly difficult to live without. The ability to see your friends and leave your house freely. The fear that you will be potentially transmitting this virus. I mean, it's illustrated the fragility of some of the things that we take for granted. And our hope is that we will be more grateful for these things going forward, now that we know how easy it is to lose them and to lose our loved ones as well.
So after not being able to plan or look forward to anything pretty much for months and months, the hope that the vaccine program has brought means that we are now beginning to think about, or maybe I can get away for a few days over the summer holiday.
Absolutely. I mean, I think one of the things that has been very hard for people to cope with throughout this pandemic is how formless the future becomes when you can't plan anything in it, when you can't say, I'm going to celebrate this birthday or go on this holiday or have a meal with my family next week, whatever. Things like that give the future and give our lives structure and I think
meaning.
And meaning. And it is something that I think people, it is a relief to be able to plan for the future in some way again. And even if it's not as anxiety-free as it might have been before, and even if we do have to keep in mind things like social distancing and so forth.
Well, obviously we were all very overwhelmed with what had happened in the ERS with the outbreak. The vaccine program was like the light at the end of the tunnel. We received support from my colleagues, from the residents and the families themselves. So we could sort of see like the end of what was the worst days of our careers in the ERS.
GBC, the newsroom, has a tribute planned to those whose lives unfortunately were claimed by this pandemic. Our colleague Jonathan has spearheaded an excellent initiative.
Yes, so we've seen, for example, the Chief Minister mentioned that there will be a memorial and there will be an interfaith service. But once Gibraltar has time to reckon with what it's gone through after this virus has basically washed over us like a wave, leaving over 90 deaths. The most recent of which was just days ago. And one of the things, as you say, that we're planning to do is in GBC, we're asking for people to send us photos and information and memories about the ones that they've lost. And as those have started to come in, and we've had a number of them already, it has just been incredibly emotional and moving to look at those and put faces and anecdotes and stories to those statistics. You know, each of these people has a family and has achievements and had hobbies, and it is really moving to look at those as they come in, and I think it will be something that people will find very powerful and necessary.
Okay, so we'll be doing that in the coming days and weeks, and anyone watching this who wants to get in touch with us can do so. Concluding thoughts, we're talking about a year of reporting on this pandemic, a year like no other.
It feels like it was a long time ago, and yet it becomes so normal, and yet it feels like it happened to somebody else. Like I said at the beginning, it's like reading a horror novel, just the way different things have developed throughout it. The cases coming, the worries over resources, the impact on schools, the impact on the elderly. It's just been a whole, from every aspect of society and all these different threads, it's just been a whole rearranging of our understanding of what life is. And it has been, obviously, from a reporting point of view, a remarkable thing to report on, but from a human point of view, not something that we would wish anyone to ever have to go through again. And I think one thing that has to be kept in mind with this reporting and is that it's not over, and that this continues. We have the vaccinations, we have the hope that vaccinations give. We also have the fact that we don't know how long immunity lasts. And we have the divisions that this is illustrated in society, as well as the incredible stories of frontline workers, of volunteers, of people helping each other and supporting each other. It's just, it has touched on every single aspect of life, brought out the best and worst in people, and has just been something that I don't think any of us ever thought we would live through. And it just remains to be seen if that we can keep that hope going and come out of this at some point in the future with better understanding of what's needed to ever face something like this again, and a better understanding of what's needed to help each other through it.
Christina Cortes, Senior Broadcast Journalist at GBC. Thank you so much for helping us to talk about 1 year of reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you for watching from the whole team. Viewpoint will be back at the same time next week, but bye for now.